Delta outbreak tests New Zealand's zero COVID strategy, but lockdown has brought support at home. Australia and New Zealand struggle with the new surge after defeating past outbreaks. CNN. When New Zealand went into lockdown last week over a single Delta case, critics were quick to mock the country's risk-average approach. British newspapers didn't hold back. The Times called New Zealand a mysterious socialist hermit nation, while the public languished in the COVID prison, while the Telegraph slammed a once welcoming country that had turned into an isolated despotia. The reaction to New Zealand's approach speaks to the divide on how countries across the world were handling COVID. More than 18 months into the pandemic, some countries, including the United Kingdom, have accepted that they may never eliminate the virus. So instead, they are learning to live with it. New Zealand, by contrast, is one of the few countries still committed to stamping COVID out. Hours after confirming the country's first Delta case in the community, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern ordered the entire nation into lockdown with the backing of the broad consensus across the political spectrum. 10 days later, the outbreak had spread to 347 cases, with one person in intensive care as of Friday. Fortress New Zealand, with some of the strictest border rules in the world, has been breached. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern talked to the media at a press conference on August 23, 2021 in Wellington, New Zealand. That prompted questions over the whether attempting to eradicate community transmission known as the zero COVID strategy still makes sense in a world swamped with a highly contagious Delta variant. For now, Ardern is doubling down on the strategy, even as neighboring Australia edges away from the approach. And for now, it seems the public remain on board, even if it means being a hermit nation. But New Zealand's own COVID-19 response minister has indicated the approach might not last forever. The big question for New Zealand will be what each new strategy might look like. No urgency to reconnect. Until Delta arrived, New Zealand's tough border rules had protected it from the turmoil seen in most other countries. For most of the pandemic, the country has essentially operated as normal. Sports games, music festivals, public gatherings, and dining have all gone ahead in much the same way they would have before the pandemic. So far, New Zealand has recorded just over 3,000 cases and 26 deaths. But the comparative now low death toll has come at a cost. An estimated 1 million New Zealanders live overseas, with nearly 300,000 in Australia, and many of New Zealand's 5 million residents likely have at least one friend or relative living overseas. Some haven't seen their loved ones in over a year. In March 2020, New Zealand closed its border to almost all foreigners and later required almost all returning visitors to spend 2 weeks in a managed isolation facility at their own cost. Spaces are limited to around 4,000 rooms a fortnight, and just over 167,000 people have passed through managed isolation facilities since March 2020. The fortified borders have also contributed to another major casualty: tourism. Once the country's largest export industry, overseas visitor arrivals slipped more than 98% in January 2021 compared with a year before. Manchester Street in central Christchurch is pictured deserted during the lockdown. Despite that, New Zealand doesn't seem to be any rush to reconnect with the world. There's even an us versus them mentality among some social media users who criticize the overseas New Zealanders desperate to get home for not returning sooner. That's because many still believe the upsides are worth it. The recent poll by public polling company Streaky Beak found that 84% of people surveyed supported the decision to move into lockdown last week. A separated Sticky Beak poll showed only one in four wanted the travel bubble with Australia, which had allowed for quarantine-free travel to be reopened this year. Charlotte Guzu, 28, a teacher in the capital Wellington, said going into lockdown was annoying and it hadn't taken a toll not being able to see her family in France, but she still thought the zero COVID approach was the right one. This lockdown was really tough, but before that we were just living life like normal, and it was all good. It was really chill, she said. It does seem like the pain of not having the borders open for what we got in return for the last lifestyle we get in return is still worth it. Anna Robinson, 32, spent much of the pandemic in Europe before moving back to New Zealand in April. Like Guizhou, the strict border rules come at the cost of missing out on loved ones' important moments such as births and weddings. But she thinks the New Zealand rules means that vulnerable people or people with underlying health conditions are not being cast aside. Lockdown feels like a very small price to pay for the amount of freedom and safety for the community that will come after, she said. A different approach from Australia. New Zealand doesn't need to look far to know what can happen if Delta takes hold. Neighboring Australia, once a proponent of the zero COVID strategy, continued to battle a major Delta outbreak, recording another 882 locally transmitted cases in the state of New South Wales alone on Friday. One of Australia's biggest cities, Melbourne, has now spent nearly 7 of the past 20 months in lockdown, according to Australia Broadcasting Corporation's calculations. In the past few weeks, New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian has conceded the state will need to learn to live with the virus. Last weekend, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the country needed to change its focus from cases to hospitalizations, mirroring Singapore's tone in June when the city-state said it would need to learn to live with the virus. Under our national plan, when we start hitting the 70% and 80% vaccination targets, we can start claiming back what COVID has been taking away from us. And when we do so, we must not be intimidated by the case numbers that will inevitably increase, Morrison wrote in an op-ed distributed to local media. Australian Defence Force personnel assist the public at a COVID-19 vaccination clinic in Sydney on August 18, 2021. But New Zealand is in a different situation from its neighbor. While New Zealand went into the nationwide lockdown within hours of its first Delta case, New South Wales took 10 days to impose a new lockdown across the Greater Sydney, and even then the rules were lax. By then, the contagious variant had taken hold, leaving Australia with little choice but to recalibrate. Now they are struggling to keep it under control. University of New South Wales epidemiologist Professor Mary Luce McLaws, an expert in infection prevention, said this week, "I can't see them getting back to zero. I think it's too late." That's not the case in New Zealand yet. Sean Handy, a COVID-19 modeler at Auckland University, said the country's shift response would likely allow a return to zero COVID cases. Certainly with Delta, the idea that we can ratchet up our response to Delta as the outbreak grows, that just simply hasn't been the case in New South Wales, he said. If you were able to put it off, elimination was definitely the right approach, said Handy. I don't think it's inevitable that we will have a Delta outbreak that gets out of control. Epidemiologist Michael Baker, who advised the government on its COVID strategy, told the National Broadcaster Radio New Zealand this week that elimination had been the optimal strategy up to now by every indicator we can use. Elimination is technically possible. It's being achieved across the region. I'm confident it will be achieved again in New Zealand, he said. When to drop zero COVID? Australian Prime Minister Morrison has criticized the idea of pursuing the elimination strategy forever, calling it absurd. COVID is a new, different world. We need to get out there and live in it. We can't stay in the cave, and we can get out of it safely, he said in this week. While New Zealand hasn't gone that far yet, New Zealand's COVID-19 response minister Chris Hipkins said the Delta variant raises questions about the long-term viability of the elimination strategy. It does mean that all of our existing protections start to look less adequate and less robust, he said. As a result of that, we are looking ever closely at what more we can do there. But it does raise some very big questions about the long-term future of our plans. Neither country is opening up right now. Doing so could be deadly. After struggling to get supply, New Zealand has one of the lowest COVID-19 vaccination rates in the OECD, with just over 20% of the population fully immunized. Australia, which has had the vaccine rollout beset with problems, isn't much further ahead, with 25% of the entire population immunized. Government figures put the number of fully vaccinated adults at 33%, and each opening up is contingent on that figure reaching 70% to 80%. We are saying to everybody, get vaccinated, get fully vaccinated. You still have time to make sure that when we start opening up, we have those options to live a more freer life, Barajiklian said. An information board on a deserted check-in hall at the Auckland airport on July 7, 2020. But while Australia has signaled how it could move away from zero COVID in the next few months, there's a little clarity about when or if New Zealand will do the same. Across the world, experts have said COVID may be like the flu in future, something that can kill, but some will live with. Something we live with. Handy has another comparison. Once New Zealand has a high rate of vaccination, perhaps between 70 and 80%, COVID could be treated like the measles. We don't lock down for measles, but we also don't tolerate it in the community. We mount a public health response to eliminate measles when we have an outbreak. Earlier this month, the strategic COVID-19 Public Health Advisory Group said the elimination strategy could still continue, even after New Zealand reopened its borders. On its website, the Ministry of Health explains that it will use the combination of border rules, vaccinations, and public health measures to keep people safe from COVID. The country will still try to stamp out the virus, but it may mean it relies less on lockdowns. Our elimination strategy has proved its worth and remains an achievable goal even when current border restrictions are eased, the Ministry of Health says on its website. In short, New Zealand is not planning to live with COVID in the same way as other countries. That may offer the potential for life to go on largely as it did before the pandemic. But it means the immediate future mostly close to the world. CNN's Angus Watson contributed to this story from Sydney, Australia.